June 6, 1944, Normandy coast. In the observation tower of Chrisc Battery, while dawn was still bearing the damp weight of fog, a German officer recalled the assurances of the High Command. The English Channel remained the perfect moat, the natural wall that no enemy would dare to cross on a large scale. It was the same confidence that, hours earlier, had led generals like Jodl to rule out any possibility of invasion in that unstable climate. But as the sky cleared, that certainty began to crumble. The horizon was no longer horizon. It was a continuous, dark, bustling mass, something that no German textbook described. The thesis imposed itself before him without asking permission. That was not a fleet. It was an industrial operation, a physical manifestation of what Germany had refused to see. The United States was not sending men. It was sending productive capacity. Each hull moved forward as if it were a statistic floating on the water, each silhouette a reminder that courage does not compete with multiplication in scale. The conflict that was announced was simple and devastating. The Wehrmacht was expecting a landing. What arrived was a war machine capable of supplying itself, replacing losses instantly and crushing any resistance by the endless repetition of resources. At that moment, the German officer understood. The invasion was not beginning. She was already unstoppable. But before we dive behind the scenes this morning, there is one statistic that defines the whole story. While the German commanders expected a few hundred vessels, what was advancing across the English Channel was almost 7,000 ships, supported by a productive capacity so vast that in the following hours it would put ashore more men, vehicles, and tons of supplies than the German 7th Army possessed in all of Normandy. It wasn't a fleet, it was an assembly line in motion. It was not an attack. It was the harbinger of a structural collapse. Each hull carried a premonition. Germany would not face American soldiers, it would face American industry. If you value serious history, accurate data, and the revelation of how the war was really decided, please like and subscribe. It strengthens our community and keeps alive the research that reconstructs events like this. The German idea that the Atlantic War was impassable was born long before the first Allied hull cut the waves towards Normandy. It was a direct product of the Third Reich's strategic mindset, shaped by the quick victory of 1940 and the obsessive belief that the Western enemy would never be able to muster sufficient means for a sustained invasion. Hitler called that defensive line Festung Europa, the fortress that would break any sea and any army. The name, however, was more ambition than reality. In theory, it was a continuous barrier of concrete, steel, and heavy artillery. In practice, it was an irregular mosaic of incomplete fortifications, commanded by generals forced to fight in the present with tactics inherited from the past. There was trust, yes, but it was a trust built on shaky ground. The defensive structure followed the logic of 1916, not that of 1944. The trenches were reopened with the same ritual as 3 decades earlier. The machine gun nodes were positioned as if the war was again defined by long static lines. The minefields were distributed in a planned manner, but without the necessary depth to delay an enemy willing to absorb initial losses to ensure the advance of the following waves. Germany believed that discipline, geography, and the power of fixed guns could hold back any army that tried to break through the line. This vision ignored the logistical revolution that had shaped the United States in previous years, a country that had turned its production lines into extensions of its military doctrine. The greatest irony is that many of these problems were known to the very officers who patrolled the defenses. When Rommel took over some responsibility for Normandy, he found scarce equipment, entire sections without heavy artillery, and miles of coastline without adequate cover. The requests for reinforcements came up against the same answer. There was no material available. The Luftwaffe, increasingly suffocated by a lack of aircraft and fuel, could not guarantee constant surveillance. The Kriegsmarine, reduced and fragmented, could not prevent the approach of a concentrated fleet, but the High Command insisted. The fortress was supposed to work because in theory it worked. However, the theory collided with industrial reality even before the first Allied soldier landed. While Germany was deploying static guns along the coast, the United States was producing landing craft at an almost automatic pace. While German generals calculated how many artillery rounds could be sustained in a counterattack, the Americans manufactured ships capable of carrying enough supplies to equip entire divisions. The Reich still believed that war would be defined by courage and precision. The US had already accepted that it would be decided by multiplication, replacement, and volume. German confidence in static fortification also disregarded the technological factor. The defenses were designed to deter ships and infantry, but not to confront Allied air supremacy, which had already shown itself to be absolute in the previous months. Rommel warned numerous times, without air cover, any concentration of German troops would be easily destroyed before even engaging in combat. But his warnings were treated as excessive pessimism. The result is that the troops assigned to defend the coast were scattered, poorly coordinated, and unable to maneuver under enemy surveillance. Even the fixed guns, considered the backbone of the wall, were vulnerable to accurate naval attacks guided by expert observers. During this period, the German High Command ignored a fact that had already become evident to any attentive analyst. American production of ships, aircraft, and vehicles outperformed German production in multiple factors. Here is a pause for the statistic that many officers simply refused to accept. In 1944, the United States produced more than 29,000 tanks, while Germany in the same year produced about 1,154. The difference is so monumental that, if this surprises those who watch, it is worth recording in the comments a simple word that sums up this shock: absolute power, unbelievable, shocking data, or logistics wins. This disparity was not just industrial, it was doctrinaire. While the Allies regarded vehicles, ships, and aircraft as consumable elements, replaceable and abundant, Germany treated them as valuable parts, difficult to replace, used with extreme care. The result of this philosophical difference was evident. Every German weapon had to survive in order to keep fighting. Every American gun could be replaced instantly because the production line never stopped. The German belief in the Atlantic Wall also started from a mistaken premise about the enemy. Hitler and many of his generals were convinced that the Allies would never risk a gigantic offensive without exceptional moral strength. They underestimated their opponent because they evaluated the world by their own limits. For them, large-scale logistical coordination was unfeasible because Germany itself could not do it. For them, assembling thousands of ships was impossible because German industry could never produce something similar. Thus, the German doctrine became a victim of its own experience. What his generals considered impossible was, for the United States, only the result of planning, resources, and manufacturing capacity. When the Germans erected their defenses in Normandy, they imagined that even if the enemy dared to attack, it would come in manageable waves capable of containment. So they built sector-oriented bunkers designed to create fire intersections. But the wall was not designed to face hundreds of vessels simultaneously. It was not designed to handle warships capable of pulverizing fortifications from miles away. And above all, it was not designed to face an enemy that could lose dozens of vessels without compromising the operation. The German defensive logic required perfect efficiency. The American offensive logic allowed for infinite redundancy. And so when the German officer looked out to sea that morning, he beheld not only the approach of a military force, but the collapse of the entire defensive structure on which his country referred. He saw, in silence, the overwhelming proof that the wall that was supposed to stop the world had been built on outdated premises, and that was just the beginning of the shock. In the next part, he would discover that the fleet that now filled the horizon was not the biggest problem. The real blow would come from what this fleet carried with it, and from the guns that were about to speak with the precision of an entire factory pointed at the coast. The blindness of the German command that morning was not an accident, but the direct result of a chain of decisions made in absolute disconnection with the material reality of the enemy. As the first Allied ships appeared on the horizon, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was hundreds of miles away in Herrlingen, preparing flowers for his wife's birthday. For him, the climate made any disembarkation unfeasible, and, like so many other officers, he believed that the Allies would never risk an operation of such magnitude without clear skies and calm seas. This conviction was shared by Hitler, who that same morning slept peacefully in Berchtesgaden, forbidding anyone to wake him up until the first news was confirmed. Germany viewed the world through the lens of its own limitation. If it was obsessively dependent on the weather, the precision and the rarity of its resources, the enemy was supposed to do the same. This false symmetry would be fatal. The General Staff in Paris, led by General Jodl, assessed that the Great Offensive would inevitably come through Calais. This expectation was not only strategic, it was emotional. Calais was the narrowest point of the Channel, the most logical for an invasion. It was also the most fortified sector. Believing this wasn't just convenient, it was comforting. Normandy, with its wide and less protected beaches, was seen as a secondary target. Unlikely. It was easier to imagine that the enemy would choose the obvious path, the path that Germany feared, rather than the path that she underestimated. While the Allies built a monumental system of deception, with fake radios, phantom divisions, and even rubber tanks, the Abwehr and German military intelligence absorbed these signals as definitive truths. Confidence in the analysis itself prevented any questioning. The Allies, at this point, were already winning before the first shot. The greater irony is that German doctrine itself required quick initiative, immediate responses, and fierce mobility. However, the Western Command remained paralyzed by bureaucracy, rigid hierarchies, and the need to wait for direct orders from Hitler to move any armored units. The famous panzer divisions, considered the steel fist of the Reich, were literally parked waiting for a permit that would only come hours after the landing had begun. This hesitation turned valuable tanks, still powerful when concentrated, into useless pieces scattered in the wrong places. The climate was another point of blindness. For the Germans, strong wind and rough seas were absolute obstacles. For the Americans and British, they were calculable variables in a larger equation. The Allied command had accepted, from the initial planning, that meteorological perfection would not exist. Industrial supremacy allowed it to absorb risks that Germany could never afford. If some vessels were lost or delayed, hundreds more would take over their role. The logic was simple. When you have a lot, losing a little does not change the fate of the operation. When you have little, any loss is catastrophic. German perception of the climate reflected its own scarcity, not the enemy's capability. This difference in mentality was also manifested in the informational field. While the Allies operated with constant reconciliation between intelligence, logistics, and production, the German command made fragmented decisions, often based on incomplete reports, or, worse, distorted by the need to tell the Führer only what he wished to hear. Hitler firmly believed that the Allies were exhausted, unable to sustain a prolonged effort. This belief came from his limited view of the American economy, which he never understood in depth. He imagined that the United States suffered from the same restrictions on fuel, rubber, steel, and labor that haunted Germany. The mistake wasn't just strategic, it was mathematical. Army Group B reports, received the night before the invasion, already showed clear signs of intense air activity, continuous bombardment, and unusual naval movement. General Hans Speidel, experienced and meticulous, warned that something big was about to happen. But his warning ran into the rigid decision-making structure, which required confirmation from multiple instances before any action could be taken. Thus, when the first paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Divisions fell on Normandy, only a few isolated commandos attempted to react. The German war machine was waking up late, slow and uncoordinated. In contrast, the Allied machine had already been in full swing since the previous dawn. This collective blindness was also rooted in pride. Germany had become accustomed to winning by tactical superiority, the brilliance of its commanders, and the discipline of its troops. He deeply believed that human intelligence, courage, and precision would make up for any material disparity. It was a romantic vision of war, anchored in a past that the industrial world had already left behind. When Rommel warned that Normandy was fragile and that Germany should expect the worst, many generals considered him alarmist. When he warned that the enemy would come en masse, he was accused of exaggeration. No one imagined that the commander who had won the war in the desert knew exactly what he was saying. Modern warfare belonged to those who dominated supplies, not those who dominated maps. The bitterest irony is that at that critical moment, while the Allied fleet was already organizing to bombard the coast, the German command still believed it was in control of the situation. In the first intercepted radio messages, officials said it was only a limited operation, perhaps a test, perhaps a distraction. The German mind, shaped by its own limitation, could not conceive of the scale that the enemy was about to demonstrate. Only hours later, When the coastal batteries began to be swallowed up by the bombardments of the Allied ships, the first shadow of truth appeared. This was no ordinary invasion. It was something never seen before. And yet, this would only be the first blow. The next, more devastating, would come when the defenders finally saw what was advancing behind that first line of ships. Not just soldiers, but the revelation of an industrial power so vast that it would render the Atlantic Wall irrelevant in a matter of hours. When the German officer raised his binoculars again in the observation tower of Chrisc Battery, the sea was no longer sea. The waterline had disappeared under a heavy, uniform, almost organic movement, as if a single metallic creature were advancing toward Normandy. At first glance, it looked like a sequence of dark spots. Seconds later, it became clear. They were ships. Not dozens, not hundreds, but a continuous mass that nullified any visual reference. The canal, once a silent ally of the German defense, had been replaced by a surface of steel, steam, and intent. The first silhouettes were recognizable, battleships and cruisers, whose heavy turrets betrayed calibers capable of spraying concrete. Close behind, the smaller geometry of the destroyers cut through the waves like repeating blades, each moving with machine-like precision. Further on, whole columns of LSTs, LCIs, LCTs appeared, categories that many Germans had never studied, because their manuals never assumed that the enemy could assemble so many different models of vessels for a single operation. The psychological impact of this first look did not come from the noise, it came from silence. There were no shots, there were no explosions, only the distant noise of engines, a noise that seemed to never end, as if every second added another ship to the horizon. There, standing inside a bunker that had been built as a symbol of security, the officer realized that the feeling of protection had disappeared long before the first shot. He tried to tell him, not to report to the command, but to understand what he was seeing. The human reflex of rationalizing the impossible. He counted 20, then 50, then 100. At 100, the mind collapsed in numbers. The exercise has lost meaning. And it is precisely this point that defines the shock of that morning. The mind trained to calculate range, ammunition, firing sectors and landing routes was not able to account for the basics, the quantity. In later testimonies, German officers repeated almost the same phrase, as if they had all been struck by the same simultaneous perception. I tried to count. I stopped at 100. 100 was the human limit. In addition, the domination of industry began. The enemy they had been trained to face possessed finite numbers. What was advancing that day seemed infinite. The vessels, arranged in layers, became a landscape in their own right. The ironclads kept their distance, but their profiles were so large that they looked like mountains floating behind the smaller lines. Closer to shore, destroyers maneuvered like disciplined swarms, preparing to bombard specific positions. And in the rear, endless rows of transports indicated what was to come after the shot: reinforcement, replacement, supply. This sea of steel was not just the result of ship production. It was a result of the American logistics philosophy. For the US, war was not an art. It was not a tactical duel. It was a process. Entire factories had been converted to produce standardized vessels in series. Makeshift shipyards along the American coast worked day and night, following industrial schedules rather than military limitations. This meant that each ship present there was not the end of an effort, but just another piece of a system capable of generating replacements as quickly as they were destroyed. Germany, accustomed to considering each naval unit as a strategic asset, never imagined that it would fight against a country that treated ships as a natural extension of its assembly line. For the soldiers stationed in the pillboxes of Normandy, this contrast was brutal. They were accustomed to engaging enemies on understandable scales: 4 Soviet divisions, 2 British battalions, an American brigade. They knew what it meant to fight numerically superior forces, but what they saw now was not superiority, it was something different. It was numerical transcendence, a power that could not be dismantled shot by shot, because the following waves would replace the first. The German defense was based on the idea that, after repelling the first wave, it could reorganize. But in the face of that vision, there would be no first wave. There would only be continuous flow. When the first flash appeared on the deck of a cruiser, announcing the initial firing, the German officer had his second bitter realization. This immense fleet was still far from posing his greatest threat. The real danger lay in what she could sustain. Even if the Germans managed to sink 50 vessels, an absurd number for the battery's capabilities, another 50 were ready to take their place. There was no fragility in that machine. There was absolute redundancy. The Allied force did not depend on ideal conditions. It depended on the volume, and as long as the volume was secured, there was no wall, there was no fortified position, and there was no commander capable of preventing the landing. Therefore, the officer's expression changed. It was not fear. It was recognition. The same expression that centuries earlier would have appeared in front of an army unimaginably larger than its own. He realized something his command did not yet accept. The Battle of Normandy would not be defined by the caliber of a gun, the skill of a general, or the courage of a battalion. It would be defined by the difference between a nation that overproduced everything and one that struggled with what was left. The Wehrmacht, there in that tower, discovered that there was no point in having precision without abundance, nor bravery without replacement, nor strategy without logistics. And as the first wave slowly approached, occupying every inch of the visible sea, the question that emerged inside the bunkers was always the same. If this is just the beginning, what comes next? The answer would begin to emerge minutes later, when the larger ships would open fire, revealing that this sea of steel was not just carrying men. It was carrying the greatest concentration of naval firepower in modern history, capable of reshaping the French coast in a matter of hours. The numbers that morning spoke a language that no German officer had been trained to understand. When reports began to come in, describing that more than 6,900 vessels were advancing toward Normandy, many on the general staff simply refused to believe it. The German mind still functioned within the continental paradigm. Divisions, regiments, battalions, railroad corridors, columns of armored vehicles moving with millimeter precision. What emerged on the canal was something entirely different. It was war transformed into an industrial process, an assembly line on the water. Each ship was a cog in a colossal cog that had begun to turn 2 years ago, when the United States converted automobile factories, refrigerators, civilian shipyards, and even vacuum cleaner industries into centers of war production. The Germans still imagined that Allied naval power was limited to large battleships. They did not conceive of the existence of hundreds of mass-produced amphibious ships, built with the same logic that Ford applied to automobiles: standardization, speed, and replacement. The pace was so fast that on average, an LST was completed every few days, and smaller vessels rolled off the assembly line as if they were appliances packed for delivery. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content. This clash of scale became even more evident when analyzed in absolute numbers. In just 24 hours, the Allies landed 156,000 troops, more than the entire German garrison responsible for defending the region. This meant that in the span of a single day, the United States and its allies were able to transport, organize, arm, and supply an army equivalent to the size of an average European city. And each of these soldiers was accompanied by ammunition, rations, radios, engineers, medical teams, vehicle operators, and support units that multiplied the physical presence into real force. Meanwhile, the German 7th Army attempted to reorganize scattered divisions, many without sufficient transportation, others without fuel, all dependent on roads under constant bombardment. The disparity was not just numerical, it was structural. It represented the difference between a country that produced in abundance and one that struggled with what it could save from the rubble. The Germans depended on logistics that, even at their peak, had never been able to sustain prolonged operations without interruption. By 1944, this logistics was on the verge of collapse. There was a lack of trucks, a lack of rubber, a lack of steel, a lack of locomotives. In contrast, the United States had more than 650,000 military trucks produced that year alone. This fleet alone was the backbone of a global mobile army. Germany could never compete with this. It depended on horses in many units, a reality that the officer observing the sea might not have known at that time, but that he would feel in the following hours when they realized that their reserves could barely move under enemy air dominance. War for the US was logistical. For Germany, it was improvisation. Another factor that widened the chasm was the capacity for continuous supply. The Allied fleet carried hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies distributed in a planned manner, ammunition segmented by caliber, ration categorized by daily consumption, fuel divided into replenishment intervals, vehicles organized for landing in sequence. Every component of Operation Overlord had been calculated with industrial precision. Germany, in turn, had local depots, many of them already destroyed by strategic bombings. Its defenders in Normandy had enough ammunition for a few hours of intense fighting, but not for days, and they knew it. Germany had prided itself for years on its engineering ability, its elite tanks, its accurate rifles, its absolute discipline. But none of this compared to the power of a continental economy capable of making ships faster than the enemy could sink them. The United States had plenty of resources to sustain the war on two oceans simultaneously, something that no Axis adversary could emulate. This contrast was brutal. While German shipyards struggled to replace every lost ship, American shipyards produced entire fleets. It was an unequal struggle, not because of German incompetence, but because of industrial mathematics. To understand this logic, it is enough to observe the cumulative effect of numbers. If the Germans destroyed 50 ships, 100 more would continue advancing. If they destroyed 100, 200 would still be on their way. American industry was an infinite multiplier, the German defense, a finite resource that was wearing out by the minute. This asymmetry defined all the battles in that campaign. And it was in the face of this silent realization that many officers began to realize that they were fighting against something that could not be stopped, not because it was invincible, but because it was inexhaustible. At the height of this thought, when the German officer observed the fleet and tried to comprehend its scale, he was not yet aware that the most impressive figures were not even in sight. For behind that first wave was an even greater force, an even more accurate demonstration of what American industrial power would be able to do when its ships opened fire for the first time that morning. The first shot from the sea was not only the beginning of the bombardment, it was the physical demonstration of a truth that many German officers refused to admit. The Allies had turned naval artillery into a direct extension of their industrial capability. When the USS Texas adjusted its turrets and released the first 14-inch shell, the impact sounded like a collapse in the air itself. The ensuing explosion was not just the sound of a cannon, it was the noise of a factory in operation, projecting its final product from miles away. In the early hours of the morning, while the defenders were still trying to comprehend the scale of the fleet ahead of them, Allied ships began a cycle of fire so coordinated that it seemed synchronized with the rhythm of a production line. Each firing from the Texas, the Nevada, the Quincy, and the cruisers that lined the horizon carried with it a history of welding, casting, testing, standardization, and logistics. Germany, trained to see artillery as an extension of human expertise, now had to face a type of fire that came from mass-produced machines, calibrated to industrial standards, and supplied with ammunition in virtually inexhaustible quantities. For the German soldiers on the coast, the impact of naval bombardment was more than physical destruction. It was psychological shock. Pillboxes that had been built to withstand projectiles of lower calibers began to shake with each impact wave. The concrete, so proudly erected as a symbol of continental fortitude, vibrated as if it were about to shatter, and that was just the beginning. The USS Texas alone fired 255 shells during the first hour. Each one weighed more than a small automobile, dropping on the French coast a mass of explosives that no German regiment could match. It is significant that in just 60 minutes a single battleship dropped more destructive power than many German battalions possessed in their entire combined reserve. For an army accustomed to rationing ammunition, saving every shell, and carefully calculating every shot, this sight amounted to a disconcerting revelation. The enemy needed not save anything. The logic of the war had changed without Germany noticing. If in World War I artillery still depended on the wear and tear of human positions and cadences, now it had become an automated process. Allied ships had standardized reloading systems capable of maintaining constant and predictable rates of fire. Their ammunition depots were supplied by transatlantic convoys that functioned as gigantic conveyor belts, bringing full loads and carrying empty piles of ammunition shells for recycling and refueling. Each ship was more than a vehicle of war. It was a floating factory, and every shot fired that morning was a product of this system that operated with mathematical precision. For the German officer at Chrisc Battery, the realization of this change came quickly. Through the reinforced periscope of his position, he saw the orange flashes rising from the Allied naval guns, followed by the trail of white smoke. Seconds later, he felt the impact coming with the force of an earthquake. And it was enough to count the interval between shots to understand that it was not an ordinary battery. The pace was constant, almost clinical. More than that, it was impersonal. Allied naval fire did not reflect humor, improvisation, or hesitation. He followed a cadence that belonged to the industry, not the battlefield. The German defenders realized, too late, that they were fighting something that no military manual had prepared. Artillery that did not tire, did not waver, and did not stop. The German positions tried to respond. 80mm guns, Czech-made shore pieces, mortars, heavy machine guns, all opened fire in a desperate attempt to break up the bombardment. But the math was relentless. Each Allied shot cost only a few seconds of operation from an American factory. Each German firing cost minutes, sometimes hours, of risky replacement, vulnerable transport, scarce fuel, and routes disrupted by Allied bombers. Germany fought shot by shot. The United States fought ton for ton. The disparity was not in calibers, but in the carrying capacity. As the bombardment intensified, another truth emerged for the defenders. There was no invulnerable position. What once seemed solid, reinforced casemates, underground shelters, structures designed to withstand direct impacts, began to suffer cracks, displacements, and infiltrations. A German report from the morning of D-Day describes the bombardment as a continuous sequence of blows that dissolved the defensive line before it could react. And this dissolution did not depend on absolute precision, it depended on volume. When 50,000 naval shells are fired in a few hours, even inaccurate shooting becomes effective. The sea seemed to breathe fire. The German gunners, who had been trained to calculate distances, angles, and trajectories rigorously, found that their measurements were irrelevant in the face of a fleet that had gyroscope-stabilized sights and coordination with aerial observers. While the ships adjusted their salvos with precise radio-transmitted corrections, the Germans could not even maintain communication between adjacent positions, interrupted by the impact and destroyed cables. The battle was uneven even on telephone cables. For the officer at Chrisc Battery, still trying to comprehend what he was facing, came the second big revelation of the morning. If that preliminary bombardment already seemed unbearable, it was not the main attack, it was just the preparation. It was the equivalent on a military scale of the first movement of a devastating symphony. For behind that fleet of battleships and cruisers, thousands of aircraft awaited the order to begin their own chapter of destruction. A chapter that would transform the Normandy sky into an even more forceful demonstration of what Germany could never match. When the naval bombardment began to slow down, giving way to a cadenced sequence of correction shots, the relative silence that settled for a few seconds was deceptive. It was just the pause before the second dimension of the invasion revealed its full scale. The German officer held up his binoculars again, expecting to see only the sea and the approaching fleet, but what emerged above him was something no Reich commander had ever thought possible. The sky transformed into an exclusive air corridor for Allied forces. It was still early, and the morning light created a diffuse glow that made it difficult to distinguish individual shapes. But as the sound intensified, becoming a deep, almost continuous hum, the reality took shape. Hundreds of aircraft were advancing in formation, while hundreds more were already returning from their first missions. It was the prelude to a flow that, over the course of that day, would add up to more than 14,000 sorties. For every German plane in the air, there were 46 Allied aircraft flying over Normandy, a ratio so absurd that to many advocates it seemed more like fiction than war. The Luftwaffe, once celebrated as the technological pride of the Reich, had managed to launch only 319 sorties in that same period, many of them concentrated in secondary areas, unable to interfere with the Allied advance. What had once been a duel between aces, between legendary names vying for supremacy in one-on-one combats, now became an industrial massacre from the air. There was no room for heroism when the enemy possessed enough planes to replace losses instantly, while Germany struggled to supply even its remaining units with limited fuel and scarce parts. German pilots, trained as modern knights, carried traditions that went back to the romanticism of World War I, aerial combat as a test of skill, courage, and honor. The Americans, on the other hand, viewed the air war as just another industrial sector. Airplanes were designed to be simple to maintain, easy to produce, and plentiful. Training was standardized, efficient, geared toward the practical goal of saturating the enemy with quantity before even testing quality. For each experienced German pilot shot down, the Luftwaffe lost months, sometimes years, of specialized training. For every American pilot lost, there were dozens ready to replace him, trained in centers that functioned as wartime manufacturing universities. The cruel irony of that scenario was that, while Germany insisted on preserving artisanal methods of production, keeping assembly lines closer to workshops than factories, the US had converted its entire economy into an integrating machine. The result was there, visible in the sky. B-26 and B-24 bombers advancing in dense blocks, P-47 and P-51 fighters escorting them as disciplined swarms, reconnaissance aircraft circling at medium altitudes, and fighter bombers diving over German positions every few minutes. The Luftwaffe, lacking enough fuel to sustain continuous patrols, relied on sporadic takeoffs, often reacting to late warnings or interrupted by direct attacks on airfields. When Major Joseph Priller carried out his famous, mostly lonely assault on Sword Beach, accompanied only by his wingman, it didn't represent bravery, it represented despair. It was the silent confession that the Luftwaffe could no longer fight as an organized air force. He fought like a relic of a bygone era, trying to exist on a battlefield that had become incompatible with his own structure. Meanwhile, American industry was dumping 96,000 aircraft a year, a number so colossal that German reports avoided mentioning it directly so as not to shake the morale of the troops. Germany, even at its peak, had not come close to half of that. This difference was not just statistical, it was philosophical. The Germans built machines of excellence, the Americans built enough machines, and in modern warfare, mass sufficiency trumped isolated excellence. The officer at Chrisc Battery, observing the sky now taken over by successive formations, understood with absolute clarity that if the naval bombardment had demolished the defensive line, the air offensive would destroy any hope of reorganization. Every road behind the coast, every attempt to move reserves, every effort to concentrate armor or reposition artillery would be detected, pursued, and destroyed within minutes. Air supremacy was not just strategic comfort, it was an operational sentence. Without the sky, there was no counterattack. Without the sky, there was no movement. Without heaven, there was no war. And it was exactly this absence that began to engulf the Wehrmacht whole. With every dive of a P-47 Thunderbolt, every explosion caused by 5-inch rockets, every column of smoke rising from ammunition depots and vital crossings, it became evident that the Battle of Normandy was being decided on two simultaneous fronts, the sea crushing the defenses, the air paralyzing the rear. But the officer had yet to see the most unexpected blow of the morning. It was not from the sky nor from the sea, but from the ground itself, as the first landing craft approached, bringing with them an array of vehicles and makeshift engineering that would completely redefine the German logic of what it meant to raid a fortified coast. On Omaha Beach, the German officer at Chrisc Battery watched something that, for a few minutes, seemed to counter the entire oncoming industrial avalanche. The 352nd Infantry Division, veteran and positioned on high ground, turned the sand into a deadly funnel. The MG-42 machine guns, with their devastating cadence, opened fire as soon as the first landing boats approached, creating a carpet of bullets that bounced off metal ramps, pierced vests, ripped off equipment, and launched entire men into the waves. From the top of their bluffs, the German snipers watched the scene with a mixture of precision, discipline, and inevitable surprise. Each American advance seemed to be swallowed by the sea before reaching the beach. For a moment, the feeling among the defenders was that the Atlantic Wall, so humiliated by the fleet on the horizon, could still fulfill its purpose. The first platoons of the 1st and 29th Divisions were halved before they could even find cover. Bodies floated attached to their vests and craters appeared where entire groups tried to reorganize. The red sand, the chaos, the screams muffled by the wind, all suggested that Germany might be able to hold that sector, maybe even repel the landing before it gained depth. But that impression was short-lived because there was something about that scenario that wasn't part of the logic of 1940. The United States didn't back down when resistance mounted. They recalculated, they repositioned, and above all, they replaced losses as if replacing parts of machinery that cannot stop. The first sign of this difference came when Allied destroyers began to approach the coast dangerously. Dangerously for them, not for the Germans. Under normal conditions, no naval commander would approach within 1,000 meters of a fortified beach. But what the German officer witnessed at that moment was living proof that American doctrine treated its ships as disposable tools, not as irreplaceable assets. The USS McCook, USS Doyle, USS Carmick, and other destroyers advanced until they seemed almost touching the surf line, their hulls scratching unknown bottoms and risking submerged mines. And when they reached the minimum distance, they opened fire. The 5-inch guns fired so low and so fast that the salvos seemed to come from ground artillery. The German positions, previously protected by the angle of bluffs, were suddenly exposed to direct fire. Battery commanders who minutes earlier had coordinated machine guns with almost surgical calm now shouted orders as quickly as their men tried to take shelter in spaces that had not been designed to withstand naval fire at close range. For Germany, that approach of the destroyers was incomprehensible. The German Navy, with scarce resources and no spare capacity, would have treated each ship as a precious asset, to be preserved at any cost. But for the Allies, especially the Americans, each vessel was part of a gigantic whole. Losing one or even two did not change the course of the operation. The mentality was quite the opposite. Approaching meant saving infantry lives, speeding up the breakthrough of the defensive line, and above all ensuring the pace of the operation. And rhythm was everything. This philosophical difference, Germany protecting scarce means, America risking abundant means, explained why Omaha's defensive line, so lethal in the first few minutes, was now beginning to give way. When the destroyers calibrated their sights to specific positions, entire bunkers were neutralized in less than 30 seconds, turrets collapsed, machine guns were buried under concrete, and positions that once offered absolute dominance became smoking craters. The German officer realized that no matter how precise their aiming, no matter how disciplined their men were, they were facing something that did not respond to the logic of the traditional battlefield. They were facing the combination of naval technology, air supremacy, and industrial serial production applied directly over their heads. And it was at this moment that the statistic emerged that many Germans ignored until the end. In ammunition production alone, the United States manufactured about 41 billion rounds during the war, while Germany, pressured by bombing, shortages, and loss of territory, never managed to approach even a quarter of that total. If this number surprises those who watch, it is worth recording in the comments a phrase that captures this discrepancy: absolute power, unbelievable, shocking data, or simply logistics wins. Because that's exactly what happened there. Logistics winning bravery. As the destroyers continued firing, creating makeshift passages for American soldiers still trying to cross the narrow strip of sand, something began to change in the dynamics of the battle. The German units, so confident in their initial position, began to realize that they were isolated. Their telephone cables had been destroyed by naval bombardment, their radios were scarce and vulnerable, and their reserves were unable to approach due to enemy air dominance. The beach was no longer a battlefield. It was a laboratory where the difference between two military philosophies was expressed with brutal clarity. While Germany bet on the individual capacity of its soldiers, the United States bet on the collective strength of its industry. And on that day, the industry did not back down. Still, the German officer knew that the fighting at Omaha, the painful American advance, the fire from the destroyers, did not yet represent the full threat. Because behind that chaotic and bloody line came a second, even more devastating stage: the continuous arrival of specialized vehicles, engineering units, tanks, and equipment that would transform the invasion into something even more unstoppable. The real shock was not only in what landed, it was in the fact that he would continue to disembark, hour after hour, without interruption. The next part would reveal just such an endless flow, a cog that Germany could never match. The vision that formed before the German officer, after the initial collapse of the defenses at Omaha, was no longer that of a traditional landing, but that of a production conveyor belt that had taken shape over the water. He watched the first LSTs purposely run aground on the beach, opening their front doors as if they were mobile warehouses, dumping entire Sherman tanks directly onto the sand. Each tank, still damp from the crossing, moved forward immediately, without pause, without reorganization, without the hesitation that characterized previous amphibious operations in military history. Behind them, a second row of LCTs poured out smaller vehicles, jeeps, light artillery, and teams of engineers, all moving around like pieces previously arranged on an assembly line. Within minutes, the beach took on the rhythm of a living factory. DUKW's amphibious trucks, the very existence of which many German officers were unaware of, swam to shore laden with ammunition, radios, fuel, and medical supplies. When they touched the sand, they continued to rotate as if they had come out of an industrial warehouse, delivering cargo directly to the units fighting on the front line. For the defenders, that didn't make sense. It was as if the sea had become a road, and the ships mere trucks following an endless stream. Where German doctrine saw logistical obstacles, water depth, unstable tide, soft beach terrain, the Allies saw pre-built solutions. Rubber tracks were unrolled to allow trucks to move forward without jamming. Engineers placed explosives to destroy obstacles in minutes. Specialized tanks, such as the Sherman DD and other adapted vehicles, took on roles that Germany had never imagined delegating to machines. Works that would take days to be erected by conventional units were executed in hours. The beach, once a death zone, now functioned as a receiving, sorting, and distribution area. The same logic as a port, applied instantly and without depending on previous infrastructure. Meanwhile, Germany was trying to make sense of the German flow of supplies into occupied France, still dependent on vulnerable trains, damaged roads, and an insufficient number of trucks. The Reich viewed transportation as a shortage. The United States saw transportation as a weapon, and this philosophical difference defined everything that was happening there. For each unit landed, another was ready to replace, duplicate, or triple it. In just 24 hours, more than 20,000 vehicles had already touched land, a number that made any German tactical victory on the beach irrelevant. The logistics made it clear that even if the Allies lost hundreds of vehicles in the surf, there would still be thousands behind them, packed, numbered, and prepared. American truck production, for example, had exceeded 650,000 that year alone, a figure that would make any German commander immediately aware that the enemy possessed more means of transportation than the Wehrmacht possessed soldiers on a few entire fronts. The beach became a flow: disembarkation, advance, replacement, reinforcement, supply. Nothing stopped. Nothing needed to stop. Every death, every loss, every destroyed vehicle was absorbed by the continuous avalanche. The German officer, still trying to mentally record what he saw, realized that the problem was not the isolated quantity. It was continuity. There was no intermission. There was no time for reorganization. The sea had closed the logistical cycle perfectly. While one wave disembarked, another was already approaching and another was still a few hours away. The war there had ceased to be a series of battles. It had become a supply line that simply advanced towards the continent, swallowing everything in its path. And it was when he looked beyond the second wave, at the larger vessels looming on the horizon, that he understood that the flow was just beginning. Because the Allies were about to reveal something even more disconcerting. They didn't need to conquer ports. They had brought their own dismantled ports, ready to be assembled at sea. The German response to the landing began even before any official orders reached the unit's radios. In the early hours of the morning, advance patrols reported the fall of American and British paratroopers inland, while coastal observers confirmed the advance of the largest fleet ever seen in history. But when the High Command tried to react, it found that Germany no longer possessed the ability to move its forces with the speed necessary to engage an enemy that controlled air, sea, and communication. The 21st Panzer Division, located a few miles from the British sector, should have been the first piece of the response, but in practice, it was just a unit immobilized in slow motion. Every attempt at displacement was immediately detected by Allied aircraft, which circled like hawks over the Normandy countryside, diving without warning to attack any column that dared to move in daylight. The division took more than 3 hours to cover a distance that, under normal conditions, would be covered in minutes. Tanks were stuck in craters, Trucks were set on fire before they even reached the assembly points, and the main roads, which were supposed to act as logistical arteries, were destroyed by days of pre-invasion bombardment. German doctrine, so dependent on armored mobility, simply did not work when every movement became an immediate target for Allied planes and naval gunfire fired from dozens of miles away. American naval artillery, guided by forward observers stationed at high points or in low-altitude aircraft, functioned as the range extension of D-Day ships. When German units attempted to establish makeshift defensive lines, 14 and 16-inch shells began to fall on newly marked positions, destroying any attempt to organize coherent counterattacks. It was a scenario in which speed, the historic weapon of the Panzer splits, had become irrelevant. At the same time, the back roads, which could have served as alternative routes, were crowded with French refugees, disorganized German columns, and vehicles stopped for lack of fuel. The Germany of the final years of the war was no longer the motorized army of 1940. Many of their divisions still relied on horses to pull artillery, and these units were completely defenseless in the face of uninterrupted aerial surveillance. When commanders tried to move anti-aircraft batteries to protect critical sectors, the movements were detected and eliminated before they were even deployed. The lack of communication only increased the chaos. Telephone cables had been broken by the aerial bombardment, radios were scarce and often interfered with, and messengers, a traditional German method of communication, became easy targets on exposed roads. Germany, which had developed its blitzkrieg using rapid integration of information between armor, aircraft, and mobile units, now faced the opposite: operational isolation, delayed orders, and an inability to coordinate dispersed forces. The irony was cruel. The Wehrmacht, which had conquered half of Europe on the basis of speed, was now subject to a paralysis imposed not by enemy bravery, but by an Allied logistical system so efficient that it had turned every mile of Normandy into a danger zone for any German soldier. When finally some units of the 21st Panzer managed to approach the front, they found themselves under simultaneous attack by naval gunfire and fighter bombers, as if the coordination between sea and air was being operated by a single mind. And in a way, it was. The Allies had built an integrated communications system that allowed ships to correct their firing based on information from observers on the ground, and planes to adjust their attack missions based on direct reports from troops on the ground. Germany, still stuck in fragmented methods, had no way to compete with this technological convergence. In addition, German reserves were scarce. Most of the armored divisions were positioned far from Normandy, expecting an attack that the High Command insisted would take place at Calais. Thus, when Rommel tried to request the movement of panzer units, he ran into the suicidal bureaucracy of the OKW. Hitler had decreed that the armored vehicles could only be moved with his personal authorization, and Hitler, on that critical morning, was still asleep. This mixture of doctrinal rigidity, delayed communication, and logistical incapacity meant that even when the Wehrmacht tried to react, it reacted too late. In several reports, German officers recorded the same feeling. It was not possible to fight, because the enemy attacked even before an order could be transmitted. One of them described it with harrowing accuracy. It seemed as if every road was being watched, each group was affected, every move punished. For the officer at Chrisc Battery, observing everything from afar, the reality became clear in an almost painful way. Reservations would not arrive on time. Local resistance, no matter how brave, would not alter the course of the battle. And above all, the classical notion of a decisive battle had died in that instant. What was underway was not a battle, it was a system. And the Allied system worked. But the next blow would be even more devastating, because the Germans were about to discover that the Allies didn't need to capture a port to supply the continent. They had brought their own dismantled ports, ready to be assembled at sea. The shock did not come from a shot, a bombardment, or a rupture in the front line. It came from the sea again, but this time in a form that no German officer had contemplated in even the most daring scenarios described by the High Command. Days after the landings, when German reconnaissance aircraft finally managed to cross in risky flights the Allied air curtain and photograph the Normandy coast, the images that returned to the generals' desks caused absolute incredulity. Where once there was only beach and ruins, now something that resembled an entire port emerged, but a port that did not exist in French geography. They were rectangular structures, floating roads, metal platforms, huge concrete blocks, lined up as if they had been invoked from the bottom of the sea. The Luftwaffe sent the negatives for analysis repeatedly, thinking it was error, distortion, or overlapping images. It wasn't. The revelation struck German officers as the ultimate realization that they were fighting not soldiers, but engineers. The Allies had built artificial harbors, the Mulberry ports, and assembled them piece by piece like gigantic mechanical toys in the middle of the English Channel. For a Reich that had spent years fortifying royal ports, that regarded maritime installations as vital logistical bottlenecks, that image was a direct affront to its military logic. Hitler had bet that without capturing Cherbourg or Le Havre intact, the Allies simply could not sustain an army on French soil. And this bet, like so many others he made that year, collapsed in the face of the industrial creativity of the West. The Mulberry ports were not improvised. They were the result of planning that had begun as early as 1942, when British and American intelligence concluded that any large-scale landing would require an independent solution to destroyed tides, weather, and infrastructure. The answer was to create two entire transportable ports, built in sections in England and towed to France after D-Day. The scale of this undertaking bordered on the impossible: more than 600,000 tons of cast concrete, dozens of modulated metal piers, miles of floating roads connected by flexible joints, and 93 old ships deliberately sunk to form gigantic breakwaters, known as gooseberries. The operation not only defied geography, but overcame it. Where there was no bay, they created shelter. Where there was no pier, they positioned platforms. Where Germany was counting on a lack of ports to halt the Allied advance, the Allies responded by eliminating the need for ports. The Germans, accustomed to seeing war as a conflict between physical borders, now had to face the fact that their opponents had decided to redraw their own coastline to serve their strategy. It was applied engineering as a weapon. The German officer at Chrisc Battery, upon receiving reports of what was being built along the coast, understood that this was the absolute breaking point. For years, Nazi propaganda had hammered home the idea that geography protected the Reich. The rivers, the mountain ranges, the harbors, the straits, all these were presented as natural barriers that would restrict the Allied advance. But when he examined the map of Normandy after the report from the ports, he noticed that the last barrier had been demolished. A port can be bombed, it can be blocked, it can be sabotaged, but what to do with a port that did not exist before the invasion, which is brought in hundreds of pieces by tugboats, as if it were mountable furniture? How to stop something that simply appears when necessary, that anchors itself to the sea and starts operating on the same day? This question, silent and distressing, crossed the minds of experienced officers, who until then believed that they could prolong the war in France through the systematic destruction of enemy supply routes. The scale of the Mulberry's operation represented another profound blow: industrial capacity. Every section of quayside, every concrete block, every stretch of floating road had been mass-produced, stocked, numbered, painted, tested, and prepared for assembly. England had turned into an assembly line that produced not just guns, but entire pieces of infrastructure. Meanwhile, Germany was losing royal ports to strategic bombing, seeing its docks flooded, its shipyards in ruins, its engineers being redirected to desperate projects like V1 and V2. The comparison was devastating. Where the Allies built multiplying solutions, Germany tried to preserve scarce resources. Where the Allies manufactured structures that could be replaced, enlarged and repositioned, Germany defended fixed installations that, once destroyed, could never be recovered. In less than 2 weeks, the Mulberry A, in the American sector, was already handling 9,000 tons of supplies a day, more than many fully functioning French ports. Tanks, ammunition, trucks, fresh troops, medicines, fuel passed through it. What arrived through the artificial port fueled an entire offensive. There was no way to compete with that. For the Germans, the ultimate perception was almost cruel. Even geography had been industrialized, and for an army that had built its doctrine on technical terrain mastery, the use of rivers, forests, roads, and natural alignments to conduct operations, to see its last advantage nullified by engineering, was tantamount to watching the end of its own military age. The officer at Chrisc Battery did not need orders from the High Command to grasp the significance. If the enemy could set up ports where he wanted, when he wanted, and in the quantity he needed, then the war of resistance was lost long before any counterattack was launched. And that led him to an even more disturbing question, one that echoed across all German fronts that summer of 1944. If the Allies could build ports, what else could they build? The answer would soon come, not in the form of ingenious floating structures, but through a maneuver the Germans had not even imagined possible, an American breakout that would turn Normandy into a corridor of rupture and make entire divisions of the Reich disappear from the map. For weeks before D-Day, while the German officer at Chrisc Battery relied on the formal reports of the High Command, a second war, invisible, silent, and far more sophisticated, had already been waged against him. It was information warfare, waged not with armored divisions but with fake radio signals, rubber inflatables, fictitious barracks, simulated traffic, and generals carefully positioned to deceive. It was Operation Fortitude, the plan that ensured that when the Allies landed in Normandy, Germany still believed, with absolute conviction, that the real attack would come at Pas de Calais. For an army that had built its reputation on accurate intelligence, reading the terrain, and mathematical calculation, fortitude was a defeat that struck at the core of their self-confidence. The Allied strategy exploited not only their shortcomings, but their prejudices. The Reich believed, because it wanted to believe, that the main landing could only take place at the narrowest point of the English Channel. He believed that Patton, the offensive general, would lead the charge. He believed that any other beach would just be a distraction. The Allies, realizing this, decided to turn these beliefs into traps. Thus was born the first U.S. Army Group, an army that did not exist. Inflatable tanks were positioned on visible Luftwaffe fields. Wooden vehicles were distributed on strategic roads. Radio signals transmitted messages from fictitious units, created exactly to be intercepted. And the final play of the theater was George S. Patton, placed as commander of the Phantom Force, lending the decoy credibility that Germany would not dare doubt. When the first Allied vessels touched Normandy, the High Command was still convinced that it was a secondary attack. The proof of this was in the internal reports of the Wehrmacht. The panzer divisions held in Calais could not be moved without direct authorization from Hitler, who insisted that the real invasion was yet to come. And so, as the Allies advanced into Normandy, some 19 German divisions, including some of the best armored formations, remained stationed 250 kilometers to the north, waiting for an enemy that did not exist. The defeat, therefore, had begun before the first shot. It was an intellectual defeat. The Allies had proven that they could shape German perception as efficiently as they shaped steel. And the most humiliating thing was that the Germans did not notice. German intelligence, once celebrated as one of the most aggressive and efficient in Europe, had become rigid, stuck to dogma, relying more on expectation than analysis. Germany saw patterns where there was manipulation. I saw confirmations where there were forgeries. And it ignored real signs that could have changed the course of history. The officer at Chrisc Battery, listening to fragments of conversations between superiors, began to understand that the battle had been lost long before the ships appeared on the horizon. They were deceived in months, not hours. By the time they finally discovered the truth, that Patton commanded only a rubber army, it was too late. And it is at this point that the statistic that many ignore becomes crucial. During the year 1944, the Allies produced more than 2,000 false intelligence operations, while Germany, mired in bureaucracy and loss of agents, produced less than 200, a difference of 10 to 1. If this number surprises those who watch, it is worth registering a comment that captures this asymmetry: absolute power, shocking data, unbelievable, or logistics wins. Because here the logistics that won was not just material, it was mental. For the German officer, the final understanding came in the form of silence, that kind of silence that is not the absence of sound, but the sudden realization that everything around was being interpreted in the wrong way. He understood that the Allies had planned the invasion so deeply that even their mistakes seemed deliberate. They suffered losses, but they advanced. They faced resistance, but they kept going. Because war for them was an accurate calculation, and the whole equation had been solved before the first soldier had even touched the beach. But this revelation, while devastating, would not be the last. There was still a darker and more uneven chapter to come, when Germany would discover that the same industry that had built ships, tanks and ports had also created something capable of crushing entire divisions in minutes, the saturation bombing that would pave the way for the American breakout from Normandy. The first weeks after D-Day were marked not only by slow advances and bloody fighting, but by a deeper and more devastating process, the systematic dismantling of the divisions that, for years, had been presented as the absolute elite of the Reich. The 12th SS Panzer, made up of young fanatics from the Hitlerjugend, the Panzerlehr, considered the model division of German armored doctrine, and the very elite panzer units that had swept Europe in 1940 now entered the Normandy battlefield, carrying not only tanks and rifles, but the doctrinaire arrogance of a country that insisted on believing that human quality would compensate for any material inferiority. And it was exactly this belief that first shattered. The 12th SS Panzer, so celebrated for its strict discipline and aggressiveness, encountered an enemy who was unimpressed with bravery. The columns of armored vehicles advanced with precision, but with each attempt to reposition, they were swallowed up by air attacks from P-47s and Typhoons, which appeared with the impersonality of a clock telling the hours. The division's young soldiers, trained for hand-to-hand combat and inspired by the propaganda of invincibility, found that their courage could not stop 60-pound rockets launched from diving at 600 kilometers per hour. Within 6 weeks, the unit that entered Normandy with more than 20,000 men and 150 tanks was reduced to just over 300 survivors and no operational armor. An army of fanatics destroyed by a moving factory. Panzerlehr, perhaps the most professional and technically capable German armored division, suffered a similar fate. Considered the showcase division of the Wehrmacht, equipped with the latest in the world, Panthers, Tigers, self-propelled howitzers, it was pitted against the Americans near St. Lo with the rigid confidence that its experience would balance the scales. It didn't balance. The saturation bombardment that preceded Operation Cobra, carried out by about 1,500 heavy bombers, fell exactly on their positions. In less than an hour, entire companies ceased to exist. Tanks were turned into metal toys, and the unit lost progression, command, and communication. The German doctrine, built on the clever use of mechanized units, simply could not operate in an environment where any concentration of vehicles became a target for aircraft guided by ground observers. Panzerlehr was not defeated in the open. It was erased from the map by Allied industrial convergence, but perhaps the most symbolic collapse was that of veteran panzer divisions such as the 2nd and 116th. Accustomed to moving at speed, penetrating enemy lines and exploiting gaps, they found themselves stranded on narrow roads, attacked by planes, paralyzed by lack of fuel, and torn apart by naval gunfire sent from ships located more than 25 kilometers from the coast. The commanders, some of the most experienced in Germany, wrote reports that bordered on despair. One of them confessed, "We do not face enemy divisions. We face a system that calculates where we will be and destroys before we arrive." This phrase synthesized the emotional rupture within the officer corps itself. For decades, German military doctrine had been based on the figure of the superior soldier, individual courage, iron discipline, and tactical flexibility. But none of that mattered when every German soldier faced dozens of continuously supplied American soldiers, supported by trucks that never stopped, planes that never ceased, and ships that never ran out of ammunition. And this is where a fact emerges that many ignore, but which explains the fate of these divisions. In 1944, the United States produced more than 29,000 tanks, while Germany, under constant bombardment and chronic shortages, produced about 6,000, a difference of almost 5 to 1. If this number is astonishing, it is worth noting in the comments a phrase that captures this brutal asymmetry: absolute power, shocking data, unbelievable, or logistics wins. For the German units, the psychological impact was as great as the operational one. The Nazi idea of human superiority, fervently cultivated since the 1930s, collided head-on with American material reality. In several interrogations after the war, German officers repeated the same finding. The Americans were not weak, nor fearful, nor poorly trained. As the propaganda insisted, they were efficient. They had supplies. They had radios. There were trucks. They had so many tanks that they could lose a dozen a day without compromising the operation. And they had, above all, an economy capable of replacing what was destroyed before the sun went down. Thus in Normandy, it was not just the physical body of the Wehrmacht that broke down, it was their belief. Because when the most feared divisions of the Reich were crushed by a force that seemed inexhaustible, a question began to circulate among the German officers themselves. If our best units disappeared like this, what will happen when the Americans finally make their way? The answer would come soon, quiet, overwhelming, and arithmetic, when Operation Cobra turned the battlefield into ruin, and showed the world that the Allies' true weapon was the ability to engineer destruction on an industrial scale. Operation Cobra marked the moment when the war was no longer comprehensible to any German soldier still stuck in the traditional combat categories. The officer at Chrisc Battery, now receiving fragmentary reports from units trying to resist in the Normandy countryside, heard descriptions that did not belong to the military vocabulary of 1940. There was no talk of engaged troops, stable front or organized resistance. There was talk of disappearance, in evaporation, in craters so deep that they swallowed vehicles whole. The prelude to this transformation began on the morning of July 25, 1944, when the sky, already weeks overrun by the Allies, was taken over by something no German soldier imagined seeing throughout his career. More than 1,500 B-17 and B-24 heavy bombers lined up in successive waves, followed by hundreds of medium bombers and fighter bombers loaded with cluster bombs and napalm. They were not tactical attacks, but arithmetic attacks. Each aircraft carried tons of explosives. Each squadron had targets predefined by maps drawn with industrial precision, and each wave was calibrated to ensure that in the end, no point of that 6,000 by 2,000 meter strip of land remained intact. The goal was not to break a line, it was to erase a division. At 9 a.m., when the first bombers appeared on the horizon, German soldiers still believed it would be just another intense air raid, like so many others since D-Day. They did not come in spaced rows. They came like rain, a rain that did not cease, that did not follow a pattern, and that reached everything without distinguishing trench from road, armored from tree, commander from recruit. In less than 10 minutes, the entire sector was engulfed by dust, fire, and shrapnel. The Luftwaffe, reduced to a handful of aircraft, did not even try to react. There was no possible reaction when the atmosphere itself seemed to tremble. The physical impact was indescribable. Panzer tanks, some of the world's most feared models, were turned upside down, their hulls deformed as if they were made of tin. Whole regiments disappeared. Many soldiers did not die by direct blast, but suffocated when ground pressure, raised and rearranged in shock waves, collapsed trenches and underground shelters. The German artillery, positioned to contain armored advances, never imagined having to resist successive tons of bombs falling on a single geographical quadrant. The sector designated for the bombardment turned into a lunar landscape, where every square meter was a crater. In the midst of the chaos, a cruel and unexpected symbol emerged: the death of U.S. General Leslie McNair, one of the most important officers in the U.S. Army. He was hit by bombs dropped by his own planes, in a miscalculation caused by the density and speed of the attack. McNair's presence in the area already demonstrated American confidence in the soundness of his operation. His death, tragic and accidental, showed another brutal truth. This form of warfare was so vast, so overwhelming, that even Allied commanders were not safe within a few miles of the line of fire. For the Germans, however, McNair's death brought no relief or sense of advantage. It brought only the realization that even the Allies were secondary victims of the scale they themselves had created, a scale that made the concept of direct combat irrelevant. The duel between units had been replaced by systematic erasure. The reports collected after the operation were fragments of horror. A German lieutenant wrote that after the bombing, there was no more guidance, there was no more map, there were only holes in the ground. Another said he couldn't recognize the ground where he had been entrenched the night before. Armored vehicles were found 200 meters away from their original positions, displaced by the force of the explosions. Some soldiers, traumatized beyond any medical definition of the time, were found wandering around unarmed, covered in dust, unable to comprehend whether they were still alive. Operation Cobra was not an attack. It was a seismic event. An earthquake produced by Allied hangars, factories, refineries, and fuel depots coordinated to turn 3,000 tons of explosives into a strategic breakthrough tool. To the German officer accompanying the reports, the lesson was clear and cruel. There was no ground operation that could withstand American industry. German battle doctrine, built on speed, discipline, courage, and elastic defense, simply could not operate on a field where every static position became a target and every move was murdered before it began. War had ceased to be a confrontation between armies. It was a confrontation between productive systems. The Wehrmacht struggled with what it could carry. The Allies fought with what they could manufacture. And the big revelation, the one that still awaited the German officer and his colleagues, was that the real disaster lay not just in the snake's destructive power, but in what it would allow next. The breakthrough of the German front and the beginning of the largest encirclement maneuver in the Western theatre, the Falaise Pocket, where tens of thousands of Reich soldiers would be cornered with no chance of retreat. The next phase would show that the impact of the bombardment did not end in the craters. It propagated to the entire German defensive structure, breaking its last chance to stabilize Normandy. The Pocket of Falaise was the moment when the war in Normandy ceased to be a series of German setbacks and became the complete liquidation of an army. When the German officer observed the reports coming from within, there was no longer any doubt. The Wehrmacht was not facing a tactical defeat, but the accounting closure of an entire fighting force. The bridges destroyed by the Allies, the roads under constant air attack, the absolute lack of fuel and the loss of communications made any orderly withdrawal impossible. The encirclement began to close in as the Canadians, British, Poles and Americans advanced simultaneously, compressing the last remaining units of the German 7th Army and the 5th Panzer Army into an area so narrow that at some points there was barely room to maneuver a vehicle. German tanks, which had survived since the first fighting, ran out of fuel and were abandoned on the side of the roads, many still with dead crew members next to their hulls. Artillery batteries were left behind because the horses pulling them had been killed by aerial strafing. Burned-out trucks formed veritable metal walls, and human and animal bodies mingled in a landscape that seemed less like a retreat and more like the end of a world. Every day the siege tightened. German attempts to escape the pocket were quelled by indirect fire, air raids, and Polish and Canadian defensive positions which held high ground with determination. Internal reports spoke of columns of wrecked vehicles stretching for miles, of soldiers trying to flee on foot, carrying wounded, without water, without ammunition, without direction. The irony of this story is that the solution to understanding this catastrophe was always before them. Allied logistics operated with assembly line precision. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support, like and subscribe, so we can bring you more in-depth content. The final numbers of the pocket were an unappealable sentence. Between 40,000 and 50,000 German soldiers were captured. Between 10,000 and 15,000 died during the siege. More than 350 tanks, self-propelled guns and armored vehicles were destroyed. More than 2,400 trucks were abandoned or burned, and more than 250 artillery pieces disappeared under the crushing weight of Allied fire. For the German officer, this sum did not represent only material losses. It represented the mathematical destruction of combat capability. With no vehicles, no ammunition, no communication, and no reserves, the army that emerged from Normandy was no longer a military force. It was a scattered group of survivors without structure, without doctrine, without purpose. The Wehrmacht had not suffered a defeat. It had been eliminated accountably. The collapse was so profound that even the German military spirit, built on a belief in discipline, order, and the ability to reorganize, could not withstand the impact. Officers reported soldiers crying, begging for orders that could not be given, trying to push tanks out of fuel in the vain hope of reaching the next defensive position. The reality was too harsh to ignore. The army Hitler had sent to hold France had simply ceased to exist as a coherent force. Nazi ideology, which preached the moral and physical superiority of the German soldier, found its limit in the face of an enemy capable of designing, manufacturing, transporting and employing more means of struggle than the Reich could destroy. And as the German officer tried to grasp the magnitude of that disaster, a new report came into his hands, one that didn't just talk about losses, but something even more devastating: the speed at which the Americans were advancing after Cobra. The next step would reveal that the material destruction at Falaise was not just the end of the battle. It was the beginning of the race that would take the Allies into the French countryside with a speed that no German commander believed possible. When the survivors of Normandy finally moved away from the devastated camps, carrying with them not weapons but crushing memories, something began to crumble inside them. Not a battalion, not a division, but the very idea that had sustained the German military machine for an entire decade. The officer at Chrisc Battery, who had begun the battle believing in the moral and technical superiority of the Wehrmacht, now quietly catalogued the images that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Columns destroyed to the horizon, entire units reduced to missing lists, German tanks burned like abandoned scrap metal. But what marked him was not just the losses, it was the realization that all the certainties taught in military academies, all the doctrines of tactical initiative, courage and discipline, simply had no value in the face of the kind of war the Allies had brought. From the reports, letters and memoirs that would circulate in the years to come, it was evident that the surviving Germans had undergone a profound internal transformation, a forced reassessment of everything they believed about war. In post-battle analyses, officers trained in the logic of the Blitzkrieg admitted that they had fought the wrong war with inadequate tools. General Günther Blumentritt would later write, "We did not lose to better soldiers, we lost to entire factories." Marshal von Rundstedt, before he was removed from command, had already confessed the truth that no one in the Reich wanted to hear. Make peace. What else can we do? In all these statements, one theme emerged with increasing clarity. War was no longer decided by individual courage, but by industrial and logistical systems capable of sustaining and multiplying force on a scale that Germany could not even match. Chrisc Battery's officer remembered with painful vividness the moment he saw the nearly 7,000 ships on the horizon. That was not a fleet. It was an argument. And that argument, made of steel, fuel and mass production, was now bolstered by what he had witnessed over the next few weeks. Air superiority that nullified any tactical movement, naval artillery that replaced dozens of regiments, artificial harbors that defeated geography, saturation bombardments that evaporated divisions. For him, as for many others, this sum of factors formed the most brutal conclusion. Germany had not lost due to human error. He had lost mathematically. In internal debates after the war, German officials analyzed their defeat with a frankness that contrasted with the arrogance of previous years. They claimed that the Reich, by betting on complex, expensive, and difficult-to-produce machines, had voluntarily put itself at a disadvantage. While the United States manufactured trucks like one makes screws, Germany agonized over vulnerable assembly lines and limited production. While the Allies had radios in every vehicle, every platoon and every aircraft, the Wehrmacht still relied on exposed messengers and cables. While the US produced millions of tons of fuel per month, Germany rationed drops. And perhaps the final blow came from a confidential post-war report that circulated among former commanders. It compared the total armament production of the Axis and the Allies in 1944. The conclusion was devastating. The United States alone outpaced the combined output of Germany, Italy, and Japan in virtually every critical category. The war, therefore, was not a fight between armies. It was a struggle between economies. These revelations had a profound psychological impact on officers who had believed in German superiority. The doctrine that had formed them stated that individual courage determined the outcome of battles, but in Normandy, they saw courage crushed by tonnage of bombs. They were taught that discipline and professionalism guaranteed victory, but at Falaise, they saw discipline shipwrecked in the absolute absence of supplies. They learned that the German soldier was worth 3 enemies, but now they faced an enemy who could replace 3 soldiers for every one lost, indefinitely. The conclusion was inescapable. No matter how many men were trained, how many experienced commanders survived, how many decorations were awarded, if Germany could not produce, she could not win. The emotional impact was equally devastating. Many officers confessed to feeling a kind of historical dislocation, as if they had been pushed from one century to the next without warning. One wrote, "The war we trained to fight was the war of the past. The war we faced was the war of the future." Chrisc Battery's officer, in his own recollections, described the feeling with a simple metaphor. "We were sculptors fighting factories." And this image summed up German self-criticism. While they valued military craftsmanship, the enemy had adopted industrial production as a form of force. The internal transformation was also ideological. Many officers realized that their belief in German superiority wasn't just misguided, it was dangerous. It ignored the adversary's capabilities, underestimated systems that operated beyond individual comprehension, and despised technologies that reconfigured the battlefield. The military nationalism that had fueled the Reich had been countered by the cold logic of mass production. And in the end, the most painful conviction emerged. Germany was not inferior in bravery. It was inferior in fuel, steel, rubber, aluminum, trucks, planes, and ports. It was inferior in its ability to sustain a war that had inevitably become a contest between industrial nations. But as the German officer struggled to rearrange these conclusions within his own memory, an even harsher revelation awaited, one that would come not from the ships nor the planes nor the factories, but from the very events that followed Normandy. Because the defeat did not end there. What the Allies would demonstrate in the following months would prove definitively that Normandy had not only been a turning point, it had been the announcement of the inevitable collapse of the entire Reich. When the German officer recalled the morning of June 6, 1944, what came to his mind was not just the image of ships. It was the sudden revelation that the whole intellectual fabric of the war had changed before his eyes, a change so profound that no Reich general, no matter how experienced, would have been able to comprehend it the instant it occurred. He described that continuous line of vessels not as a fleet, but as a frontier between two military worlds. The old world, where courage, initiative, and defensive position determined the outcome, and the new world, where mathematics, mass production, and logistics would define victory even before the first shot. On that steel-covered horizon, the officer did not see the arrival of enemy soldiers. He saw the physical manifestation of a country that had transformed war into an industrial process. Each ship was the product of steel rolled in Detroit, of welds made in New Orleans, of shipyards that operated in continuous shifts, of factories that did not distinguish night and day. And though he didn't know it that morning, he would later realize that he was witnessing a historical milestone greater than any battle recorded in the military annals, the ultimate transition to industrialized total war. The cruelest irony for the Germans was that this transformation was not invisible before Normandy. They simply refused to see it. For years, they underestimated American capability, describing the United States as an economic giant incapable of converting civilian wealth into effective military force. The officer recalled the words repeated in the instruction rooms. "The Americans have factories, but they don't know how to fight." It was a comforting mantra, useful for sustaining morale, but completely divorced from the reports that since 1942 had already warned of growing American production at terrifying rates. When he saw the ships lined up on the surface of the canal, this self-deception became untenable. He realized that those hulls weren't just military tools, they were numbers, there were tons, they were equations. They were the result of an economy capable of making more ships in a year than Germany could build in the entire wartime. This revelation deeply stirred the German understanding of itself, because what was at stake was not just material inferiority, it was the collapse of a worldview. German military doctrine had been built around the idea that will, discipline, and training replaced the need for abundant resources. This conviction worked in regional battles, in lightning wars, in short campaigns against unprepared enemies. But in Normandy, in front of 7,000 ships, this belief became irrelevant. The German officer came to understand that the war had ceased to be a duel of a national character and had become a confrontation of national capabilities. That moment in front of the sea, therefore, went beyond the military terrain and entered the philosophical field. It symbolized the discovery that Germany was fighting a modern war with tools of an ancient war. The weight of this understanding fell on him as an indisputable truth. He described the sensation as the instant when the past died. For when I looked at that endless armada, everything that had constituted German military pride, Prussian discipline, technical rigor, individual excellence, disappeared before an enemy who multiplied means with the same ease as a German soldier carried a rifle. Normandy, for him, was not just a German miscalculation. It was the public demonstration that the war of the 20th century no longer had room for romantic idealizations. It was exclusively about who could produce more, transport more, replace more, and sustain more. That understanding deepened over time as he began to reread those moments from the perspective of everything that happened after. The crash at Omaha, the aerial devastation, the artificial harbors, the siege of Falaise, the disorderly flight, the structural collapse. But he kept coming back to the same image, the ships on the horizon. Because unlike the bombs or the destroyed tanks, that first glimpse did not represent destruction. It represented inevitability. He knew at that moment that Germany was doomed. Not because he lacked courage, not because he lacked soldiers, not because he lacked technique, but because it lacked the only weapon capable of winning a modern war, industrial production on a large scale. The symbolic significance of that moment became so profound that the officers who survived Normandy often mentioned it as a watershed. Some said that was when they realized that the Reich had lost the war. Others claimed that it was when they realized that they never had a real chance. In all cases, however, there was the same feeling. Geography and ideology had been defeated simultaneously. The geography because the English Channel, a natural barrier that protected Europe for centuries, had been transformed into a highway, and ideology because the belief in German superiority had evaporated in the face of the vision of a country that treated war as an extension of industry. In his memoirs, the officer wrote that the image of the ships replaced the very idea of battle. According to him, war was no longer fought between armies but between civilizations capable of mobilizing resources at depths incomprehensible to those who had grown up under the structural limitations of Germany. He described this clash as the moment when I realized that we were not fighting soldiers, but an entire continent on the move. And this phrase, later repeated by military analysts, would become a powerful synthesis of the strategic truth that many still insisted on ignoring. But as the officer tried to shape this new understanding, another document would come into his hands, one that not only symbolized what he had seen at sea, but irrefutably quantified it. The next part would reveal a statistic that no German was prepared to face: the direct comparison between Allied production and Reich production, a number so disproportionate that it turned that sight of 7,000 ships into just the first page of a much larger equation. The lesson of Normandy crossed borders and decades, transforming not only German military thinking, but the way the world understood power, security, and sovereignty. As the German officer recalled the events of that day, the sea covered with ships, the sky dominated by fighter jets, the roads crushed by endless columns of Allied supplies, he realized that this view did not belong only to 1944. It was the harbinger of an entire era. The war since then would never again be decided by individual bravery or isolated tactical genius. Victory would require an integrated economy, continental planning, diplomatic alliances, and production capacity as vast as the territory to be defended. This understanding would guide post-war reconstruction, shaping how shattered nations would seek security, not just with larger armies, but with more efficient, technologically coordinated, and economically crisis-ready societies. When West Germany began to rebuild its military self-esteem in the decades that followed, it did so not with heavy tanks or armored divisions, but with factories, roads, power grids, and economic integration. That was the ultimate irony. The same Germany that believed that military discipline would vanquish any enemy now understood that the real battlefield was production. The German officer, now remembered only in his accounts, participated in military conferences and academic debates in the following decades. In these conversations, he repeated the same conclusion he had learned in front of the English Channel. In modern warfare, logistics is destiny. This simple phrase has become something of an unofficial maxim in militaries across the West. In the years since, when NATO was founded, this industrial logic has become the core of the alliance. Europe's defense against any external threat would depend on integrated supply chains, logistical interoperability, standardization of ammunition and vehicles, information sharing, and economic coordination. NATO was not born as a pact of soldiers, but as a pact of systems. This principle, by the way, derived directly from the lessons learned in 1944. No single European country could sustain the industrial pace of a protracted war against a large-scale power. Only integration could guarantee survival. Normandy's legacy has also shaped another part of the world, the United States. For them, the invasion was not just a show of force, but the ultimate proof that their industrial model was adaptable to global challenges. The country saw that by turning its civilian economy into a war machine in record time, it had gained the ability to project power thousands of miles away. This has reset his foreign policy forever. The concept of force projection, today essential to American military thought, was born there in the waters of the Channel. Every ship that crossed the Atlantic, every LST that ran aground on the beach, every aircraft that took off that day proved that infrastructure and industry were more important than the size of the army. American supremacy in subsequent years, in the Pacific, in the Cold War, and in modern conflicts, would derive directly from this realization. The world watched as the United States maintained a permanent logistics chain overseas, something few countries thought possible before 1944. And this power had not arisen from ideology or military tradition, but from the ability to transform civilian workers into workers of victory. Europe, meanwhile, has learned a different but equally crucial lesson. The war-torn countries understood that competing at scale with an industrial power like the United States would be impossible individually. This thinking helped shape the European coal and steel community, the embryo of the European Union. Behind treaties and diplomatic agreements was a silent truth. If Europe did not unify its production and resources, it would always be vulnerable. And it was in this understanding that many former German officers played a key role. Men who fought in Normandy and who saw industrial defeat before their eyes became fervent advocates of economic integration. They knew that the security of a nation in the 20th century depended not only on its army, but on its ability to produce, share, and sustain. The moral significance of Normandy has also remained alive. The sight of 7,000 ships there, brought together by dozens of nations committed to the same goal, has become a symbol of an era in which the world understood the importance of international cooperation. The operation was not just a military effort, it was a social effort. Farmers who planted wheat to feed soldiers, engineers who designed tires, workers who welded ships' hulls, women who held industrial jobs, all contributed to that vision that the German officer would never forget. Modern war, therefore, ceased to be the monopoly of armies and became the responsibility of the peoples. What is most striking, however, is how that day redefined the very notion of power. Before 1944, power meant territory, number of soldiers, cannons, and fortifications. After 1944, power came to mean something completely different: the ability to sustain, supply, replace, and multiply force. Nations have realized that weapons without supplies are useless sculptures. Soldiers without transport are spectators. Fuel-free strategies are abstractions. The image of ships in the English Channel has become a symbol of the new era, a world where logistics determine war and where economics determine the fate of nations. And while this legacy was being consolidated in the world, the German officer mentally returned to that initial moment, the silhouette of the ships at dawn, the breaking of illusion, the weight of the realization. But he still had one last reflection, one that few dared to record, and which would prepare the ground for the outcome of this story. Because the strength of that day was not just in what the Allies took to sea, but in what they left for the world after the sea parted before them. The next part would reveal the final conclusion of this arc, the human and historical significance of that officer, having seen, before anyone else, visual proof that the war had changed forever. When the German officer mentally returned to that dawn in Chrisc Battery, he could no longer see only the initial shock, but the final meaning of that vision. The 7,000 ships that had swallowed the horizon were not only the beginning of the Reich's military defeat, they represented the collapse of an entire vision of war, of an entire doctrinal framework built on individual courage, tactical genius, and faith in national superiority. Normandy had shown with cold precision that no ideal, no discipline, and no fanaticism could replace tons of steel, millions of gallons of fuel, and a logistics chain capable of sustaining battles without pause. Germany was not defeated on the battlefield, she was defeated in the equation, and the officer, as he watched that sea of steel advancing, realized that the Wehrmacht was trying to fight a phenomenon that was no longer part of the human era. It was the 20th century, industrial, continental, mechanized, pressing the past to crush it. The thesis of this history became irrefutable. Allied industrial superiority not only won the war, but rewrote the very nature of combat. From that vision came the universal lesson that would echo for generations. In modern warfare, logistics determines strategy, and volume trumps tactics. It doesn't matter how brave a platoon is if there's no fuel to move it. It doesn't matter how skilled a commander is if his artillery can't fire for lack of ammunition. It doesn't matter how accurate a tank is if it's abandoned on a road due to lack of parts. The total war of the 20th century revealed that no doctrine survives the weight of superior industrial production. And this lesson, learned among craters, ships, and destroyed columns, has become the foundation of contemporary armed forces. Battles are won at the front, but wars are won on supply. Among all the reflections that the officer would take with him for life, a phrase from a German general said years later became the definitive epitaph of that campaign. "We were defeated by trucks." Simple, brutal, and totally true. If you value serious research and the raw revelation of the story as it really happened, leave your like now and subscribe to the channel. This strengthens our mission to transform data, documents, and testimonies into accessible knowledge. And write in the comments what was the most shocking data for you in this video: air power, the sea of ships, industrial production, or the scale of the German collapse. Also, activate the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact that we are going to reveal here. Because at the end of his life, that officer knew that he had not only witnessed the arrival of a fleet, he had witnessed the arrival of the future, a future in which war would be decided not at the point of the bayonet, but by the rhythm of factories, ships, ports, laboratories, and logistics chains. When he saw 7,000 ships advancing at the same time, he also saw the silent sentence that ended his era. No individual bravery could compete against the combined strength of entire economies mobilized for the fight. It was the end of one era and the birth of another. And this history, as distant as it may seem, remains alive because it defines to this day what we call military power. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another amazing story.